Rain fell in soft, relentless sheets over Fort Worth, blurring the streetlights into long, trembling streaks of amber. The night smelled of wet asphalt and faint cigarette smoke drifting from a corner diner still open long past midnight. Somewhere, a dog barked, echoing off the brick walls of the apartment complex where Melissa Hymuth slept in her small crib, unaware of the storm outside and of the storm that would soon ripple through her family's life forever. Melissa's room was warm with the faint hum of a heater, the walls plastered with peeling wallpaper patterned in cartoon animals' bright, cheerful shapes that contrasted sharply with the muted quiet of the night. Her mother, Evelyn, sat in the worn rocking chair beside her crib, a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders, holding a Polaroid photograph in trembling hands. Melissa's tiny smile froze forever in the glossy image, a reminder of a fleeting innocence Evelyn feared she might never fully protect. The child stirred, murmuring something unintelligible in her sleep, and Evelyn's heart clenched. There was a fragility to her daughter that no lullaby could fully shield, a vulnerability in her bright eyes and tiny hands clutching the crib rail as if holding on to the world itself. Evelyn kissed Melissa's forehead, her lips lingering on the warmth of her daughter's skin. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes like an uninvited knock-dot weeks before. Melissa had begun walking along the edges of her crib, toddling with a curiosity that brought both joy and subtle worry. She reached for every sound and shadow with fearless fingers. Evelyn often watched from the doorway, the pull between pride and anxiety tightening in her chest. Every day was a delicate choreography of care. Morning bottles, soft blankets, whispered songs, careful monitoring as the child explored, stumbled, and sometimes fell. Every bruise, every bump, Evelyn cataloged silently in her mind. Every night, she wondered if the world could ever be truly safe for her tiny daughter. That night, however, something felt different, a tension in the air that she could not name. Perhaps it was the darkness pressing in through the thin curtains, or the unfamiliar creak of a neighbor's floorboard above. Evelyn tried to shrug off the unease, convincing herself that fear was a companion she had always known, shadowing her since the separation from Melissa's father. She told herself the storm outside was all there was to worry about, that the world had not yet intruded beyond its usual bounds. But deep down, a tiny pulse of premonition throbbed in her chest. Melissa shifted in her crib, a small whimper escaping her lips. Evelyn leaned over instinctively, brushing back her daughter's fine hair. She whispered, "Mommy's here, baby. Mommy's always here." The words were a fragile shield, a plea against forces she could not yet comprehend. Outside, lightning split the sky in jagged brilliance, illuminating the apartment's narrow hallways in stark, fleeting clarity. The shadows cast by the flash seemed to flicker unnaturally, like silent witnesses to something just beyond comprehension. A single shoe sat abandoned by the apartment door, a forgotten remnant of the day, a silent marker of routine. Evelyn had been meaning to tidy up before bedtime, but had allowed herself to linger in the dimly lit room with Melissa. Her mind wandered, imagining Melissa's small life stretching out in front of her. First steps, first words, scraped knees, and laughter spilling into sunlit mornings. And yet, annoying anxiety pressed at her, an invisible tension she could not name. Something about the night felt incomplete, like a story paused in mid-sentence dot in the kitchen. A clock ticked loudly, each sound amplified by the quiet, stretching minutes into seemingly endless echoes. The apartment smelled faintly of detergent and baby powder, faint remnants of the day's care. Every sound outside, the rain tapping against the window, a car door slamming in the distance, the creak of the neighboring apartment seemed magnified in the stillness. Evelyn hugged Melissa closer for a moment, letting the child's gentle warmth seep into her own fear. There was comfort, yes, but also a quiet dread that the world beyond the window had grown heavier somehow, and she could not reach it. Somewhere in the shadows of that small Fort Worth night, a presence lingered unnoticed, tracing paths and watching through dim-lit streets. The city slept uneasily under the storm, unaware that a life so young and tender was about to be pulled into a web of confusion, fear, and heartbreak. A car would soon be abandoned, a small clue left behind in the rain, whispering of something gone, something lost, something that would haunt the quiet corners of memory for decades. Melissa stirred again, tiny fingers curling around the crib rail. Evelyn whispered once more, her voice nearly breaking, "Sleep, baby. Just sleep." But the night had already begun to unravel the fragile threads of safety she had so carefully spun. And in the dark, in the rain, in the quiet, a small world prepared to change forever. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? The mornings in Fort Worth carried a different rhythm than the nights. A soft, almost hesitant light spilling through Venetian blinds, cutting thin stripes across the linoleum floors of Evelyn's apartment. The air smelled faintly of coffee brewing and wet grass from the courtyard below, a reminder that life had pressed on, even as shadows of loss lingered in quiet corners. For Melissa, every day was a series of small triumphs, learning to stack blocks, tracing shapes with chubby fingers, the occasional tumble that ended in a squeal and laughter that could fill a room with warmth. Evelyn moved with practiced efficiency. Her single motherhood required a constant balancing act, dressing Melissa, preparing breakfast, juggling the modest bills that arrived like clockwork in the mailbox. She was a careful observer of her daughter's routines, noting what brought a smile, what triggered a frown. There was an intimacy in these small observations, a dialogue unspoken yet deeply felt. Evelyn's eyes lingered on Melissa's hands as she guided them to pour milk into a sippy cup, imagining all the futures those hands might touch, all the worlds they might explore. The apartment itself was a reflection of their lives, modest, practical, yet touched with warmth. A small table by the window held a vase of fresh wildflowers Evelyn had picked herself, bright yellows and deep purples pressed against the morning sun. On the walls hung photographs, Melissa's first smile, a shy grin at the park, family snapshots frozen in time. Each image carried the weight of memory, the reminder that life, even in its ordinary moments, was fleeting and precious. Outside, the streets of Fort Worth carried their own pulse. Cars rolled slowly along wet asphalt, the neon signs of old diners flickering in reflection puddles. The air was damp with the scent of rain-soaked earth and oil from passing engines. On quiet sidewalks, shopkeepers swept the remnants of the night storm, their brooms scraping rhythmically against the pavement. Children's laughter drifted from a nearby playground, the squeak of swings and the occasional bark of a dog weaving a tapestry of ordinary life that felt almost fragile in its simplicity. Melissa's interactions with the world were wide-eyed and earnest. She noticed details adults often overlooked, the way raindrops traced paths down window panes, the softness of a neighbor's cat rubbing against her leg, the subtle differences in the patterns of clouds across the sky. Her curiosity was boundless, her questions constant, and Evelyn answered as best she could, savoring each small conversation even as fatigue tugged at her limbs. These were the rituals of love, quiet yet profound threads of normalcy that anchored them, both in a life neither could afford to take for granted. Family dynamics were complicated but tender. Evelyn's own mother lived a few blocks away, a stoic woman with soft eyes who occasionally visited to lend a hand or a comforting word. Their conversations were often muted, filled with shared concern and quiet worry. Evelyn's ex-husband, though largely absent, lingered in the periphery, a ghostly presence whose absence weighed heavily. There was an unspoken acknowledgement of the precariousness of their situation, and Evelyn carried that weight silently, shielding Melissa from the tensions that often haunted adult interactions. The small apartment building was home to a patchwork of residents, each carrying their own histories, their own pains and fleeting joys. The elevator groaned in protest as it moved between floors. The hallway walls smelled faintly of damp carpet and old paint. Occasionally, Evelyn caught snippets of conversation from neighbors, fragments that spoke of lost jobs, unfulfilled dreams, arguments held behind closed doors. It was a world that felt alive yet fragile, a community stitched together by proximity and the quiet persistence of routine. Melissa's daily life was a delicate choreography of discovery and care. She learned to feed herself with spoon and cup, her small tongue poking out in concentration. She toddled across the living room floor, exploring the texture of the rug beneath her fingers, the creak of floorboards echoing in her small ears. Each meal, each map, each playful squeal was a rhythm of survival and growth, a testament to innocence thriving in a world that demanded constant vigilance. Despite the apparent normalcy, subtle undercurrents hinted at Evelyn's constant anxiety. She triple-checked the locks on doors, scanned the streets as she walked Melissa to the small park down the block, and paused to note every unfamiliar car or stranger lingering too long at the corner. There was a careful watchfulness to her life, an unspoken fear that something unseen could disrupt the fragile stability she had carved out for her child. It was a quiet tension, ever-present yet rarely spoken, a shadow hovering over the luminous moments of joy. And in this fragile dance of daily life, Melissa's tiny victories, the grasping of a toy, the first attempt at a new word, a joyful tumble into a parent's arms, were reminders of the beauty and precariousness of childhood. Each moment was a fleeting gem, a treasure Evelyn cataloged in her mind, as if aware that the world outside their walls could never be fully tamed, never fully predictable. This was Fort Worth in 1971, a city moving forward with muted persistence, oblivious to the fractures that would soon ripple through one small apartment and one mother's fragile heart. And somewhere in the periphery, shadows gathered quietly, threading their way through streets, alleys, and empty playgrounds, waiting to disrupt the rhythm of innocence with a force neither mother nor child could yet imagine. The final days before Melissa vanished were ordinary in appearance, but carried a quiet tension beneath their routine. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through clouds, casting a gray-gold hue across Fort Worth streets, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and the faint tang of gasoline from passing cars. In the apartment, Melissa's small laughter echoed off the walls as she stacked wooden blocks with careful concentration, oblivious to the subtle anxiety in her mother's watchful eyes. Evelyn, moving through the room with a practiced calm, sensed a restlessness she could not name, a flicker in the periphery of her mind that suggested the world was slightly off its axis. Melissa's curiosity had grown in those weeks. She reached for shadows, touched objects with bold fingers, and examined every crinkle and stain on the living room carpet with the intensity of someone trying to decode the world. Evelyn watched silently, her hand hovering near the edge of the sofa, ready to steady her daughter if the exploration became too daring. She marveled at Melissa's fearlessness, at the brilliance contained in such a small frame, yet a dull ache persisted in her chest, a maternal intuition that whispered caution even in the absence of tangible threat. The apartment itself became a stage for tiny dramas and victories. Melissa learned to pour water from a small plastic cup into her sippy cup, spilling occasionally and giggling at the damp mess. Evelyn's tired hands moved to clean the floors, the soft swish of a mop against the linoleum marking the rhythm of care that structured their days. Outside, the world continued its quiet motions. A neighbor's dog barked, the wind rattled a rusted fire escape, and the faint hum of a car engine echoed down the rain-speckled streets. Life pulsed gently, insistently, yet with undercurrents that felt uneasy, almost imperceptibly wrong. In these days, Family and friends intersected with their routines. Evelyn's mother arrived briefly, carrying a paper bag filled with groceries and soft words of reassurance. She watched Melissa toddle unsteadily across the floor, her small hands brushing the sides of the furniture for balance. "She's growing so fast," Evelyn's mother said, her voice calm but tinged with worry. Evelyn nodded, forcing a smile, masking the undercurrent of dread she could not articulate. She had learned to live with fear in fragments, scattered across everyday tasks. A shadow trailing her heart. Police officers, while not yet involved, had begun to exist tangentially in Evelyn's peripheral world. A vague notion lingering from recent conversations with neighbors about missing children in other towns. News stories that filtered in through the radio or newspaper. She dismissed them as distant, abstract threats, never imagining that her small apartment, her protected routines, could soon be penetrated by a world that had grown chaotic, cold, and indifferent. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Fort Worth in 1971 was a patchwork of neon lights flickering across quiet streets, dimly lit diners with the aroma of fried eggs and coffee, and neighborhoods where children's laughter intertwined with the occasional shout or the screech of tires. Melissa's small explorations threaded through this cityscape like a bright, fragile line of color against a muted backdrop, each toddle and squeal a temporary affirmation of innocence. But shadows lingered, stretching across the edges of vision, hints of disruptions that would come with startling force. Evelyn noticed a stranger occasionally loitering near the complex, a man whose presence made her stomach twist in low, unspoken alarms. His appearances were infrequent, easily dismissed as coincidence, but in hindsight, every pause, every glance, every subtle pattern of presence became a piece of a puzzle that no mother should have to see in advance. Evelyn's intuition nudged at the edges of fear, yet daily routines, work, and care for Melissa overpowered the caution, leaving her small heartbeats of anxiety buried under the layers of necessity and love. Melissa's laughter and chatter filled rooms in fleeting bursts, moments of pure joy that contrasted sharply with the encroaching tension. She finger-painted on scraps of paper, her small hands coated in thick smears of color, leaving imprints that would later serve as echoes of a life interrupted. Her world was tactile, vivid, full of smell and sound and touch, the soft bristle of a brush, the smooth coolness of a crayon, the faint scent of spilled milk. Each detail captured the fragile tapestry of early childhood, and Evelyn absorbed them all, a silent archivist of fleeting moments. Among the adults, a sense of watchfulness grew. Evelyn's neighbor, Mrs. Carver, mentioned in passing the recent disappearance of a child 2 towns over. The words seemed inconsequential in the moment, almost casual, yet Evelyn felt a subtle tightening in her chest. She returned home to her apartment, the muted tones of the hallway pressing in, the smell of damp carpet and cleaning supplies filling the air, and checked Melissa's crib as though the small child might vanish in the interim. Police characters would soon enter this narrative, their presence foreshadowed by the hints of concern threaded through daily life. Sergeant Leonard, a middle-aged officer with a weathered face, had investigated missing children in the past, though he had not yet Melissa or Evelyn. The patterns of small-town disappearances weighed on him, a constant background of unsolved cases, dead-end leads, and the haunting questions of families left in uncertainty. The stage was being set, subtly and methodically, for an intersection of lives that would soon explode into tragedy. And yet, despite the unspoken threats and whispered anxieties, life carried on. Melissa toddled through her routines, delighted by simple pleasures, the crinkle of a newspaper, the reflection of sunlight on a spoon, the rhythmic hum of the heater. Evelyn tried to savor these moments, even as a creeping sense of foreboding pressed at the edges of her mind. Little did she know, the ordinary days of laughter, care and gentle touch were the calm before a storm that would fracture time, memory, and the very fabric of her sense of safety. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The morning Melissa disappeared was deceptively ordinary. Rain had returned in light, persistent drizzles, painting the streets of Fort Worth with a reflective sheen. Street lamps glimmered faintly in the mist, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the apartment complex like fingers brushing across memory. Inside, Melissa played on the floor, lining up wooden blocks with meticulous care, her small fingers brushing the rough edges of each piece. Evelyn sat nearby, sipping tepid coffee, eyes flicking toward the window every so often, scanning the gray streets with habitual vigilance. Melissa's laughter cut through the monotony of routine, a bright, fragile sound that Evelyn clung to like an anchor. But beneath the surface, the day was marked by subtle dissonances. A neighbor's cat prowled near the doorway, unnaturally still. A car engine idled briefly in the alley, then vanished, leaving behind an echo that lingered too long in the cool, damp air. Evelyn noticed these details, but dismissed them as coincidence, ordinary fragments of urban life. She had no reason yet to imagine that these small disturbances were precursors to a nightmare waiting just beyond the walls of her apartment. By mid-morning, Melissa had grown restless, her tiny legs carrying her from one corner of the room to another. She reached for a worn Polaroid photograph of herself and her mother at the park, the edges frayed from repeated handling. She studied the smiling faces, her thumb tracing the contours of her own image, then glanced up at Evelyn with bright, inquisitive eyes. Evelyn returned a tired smile, her heart tightening with the fragile joy of these ordinary moments, oblivious that they were rapidly becoming the last images she would have of her daughter's innocence. Untouched by fear, the timeline of that day fractured subtly. Evelyn had stepped into the kitchen to wash a cup, leaving Melissa in the living room under the soft hum of the heater. The child was playing quietly, stacking blocks, reaching for toys, spinning a small wooden car across the floor. When Evelyn returned, a brief glance toward the hallway revealed nothing unusual. The crib was empty, but she assumed Melissa had wandered nearby. Within moments, panic began to ripple beneath her carefully maintained calm. Melissa was nowhere to be seen. The search began instantly, frantic and uncoordinated. Evelyn called out, her voice thick with fear, echoing through the apartment and into the wet streets beyond. "Melissa! Baby, where are you?" The sound of her own voice startled her, trembling in the silence that answered. Doors were flung open, closets and corners scoured, yet every space yielded emptiness. A small shoe lay abandoned by the entrance, a silent, accusing clue. Evelyn's heart hammered. Instinct and terror collided as she realized that her daughter's tiny presence had vanished from the apartment without a trace. Outside, the city remained indifferent. Rain-slicked streets reflected the diffuse light of the morning. Cars splashed through puddles, and the hum of the distant freeway underscored the urgency in Evelyn's mind. She wrapped herself in a shawl, clutching the abandoned shoe in one hand, and ran down the narrow stairwell. The damp walls pressed against her, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and the faint tang of oil. She called out to neighbors, pounding on doors, her fear escalating with every unanswered knock. Small, overlooked details, the tilt of a newspaper on the steps, a half-open mailbox, a flickering street lamp became part of the visceral landscape of dread. Evelyn retraced her morning routines, trying to pinpoint the last confirmed moments she had seen Melissa. The playpen had been empty. A half-eaten piece of toast remained on the table. A small red ribbon, once tied in Melissa's hair, lay crumpled on the floor. Each item carried weight, a reminder that the familiar had been disrupted in ways that felt both surreal and deeply personal. Neighbors appeared in fragments, drawn by Evelyn's cries, their faces marked by confusion and growing fear. Mrs. Carver's expression was pale, her hands wringing a towel as she scanned the empty hallway. Others joined, murmuring reassurances, sharing what little they knew or could guess. Yet their words were powerless against the invisible absence that filled the apartment. Evelyn's mind raced, constructing and discarding possibilities, imagining every conceivable danger, every unseen hand capable of shattering their fragile world, dot in parallel. The building's exterior, the rain-slicked steps, the flickering neon of the corner diner. The shadowed alleyways became a silent witness to the unfolding horror. The wet asphalt reflected distorted images of street lamps, casting ghostly figures that seemed to chase and retreat with every movement. Evelyn's frantic search spilled into these streets, her footsteps echoing against brick walls, blending with the rhythmic patter of rain and the distant cry of a dog. Time stretched in warped pulses, seconds bleeding into minutes, each one heavier with dread. Every sensory detail became a marker of trauma. The faint metallic scent of the stairwell, the rough grain of the banister against her palms, the chilling wetness seeping through her shoes, each element etched into memory with brutal clarity. Evelyn's mind clung to the hope of finding Melissa, even as creeping awareness of the unimaginable began to gnaw at her. She returned to the apartment, scanning for small clues, an open window, a door ajar, the faintest trace of a child's touch gone astray. That day, the ordinary rhythms of life shattered completely. What had begun as a normal morning, a sequence of small, intimate acts of care and play, ended with absence. A vacuum of fear that would ripple outward, touching every corner of Evelyn's existence. The city, unaware and indifferent, continued its muted motion, but for Evelyn, for Melissa, for anyone who would come to know this story, time itself fractured. The normalcy of the world was gone, replaced by the unrelenting, jagged uncertainty of loss. The news of Melissa's disappearance spread through the apartment complex like a slow, suffocating fog. Evelyn's frantic calls to neighbors evolved into emergency calls to the local police. Officers arrived, umbrellas in hand, their uniforms darkened by rain, shoes leaving faint black streaks across the wet pavement. Sergeant Leonard, his face lined with years of procedural fatigue and quiet sorrow from unsolved cases, took the lead. His eyes scanned the scene, the crumpled red ribbon, the abandoned shoe, the empty crib, each small detail a silent testimony to the terror that had begun to engulf Evelyn's life. Search teams were quickly organized. Volunteers, neighbors, and a handful of officers fanned out through the nearby streets and alleys, their shoes splashing through puddles, flashlights piercing fogged windows, and calls of Melissa's name echoing into the mist. The wet streets amplified their voices, creating a soundscape of fear, hope, and desperation. Every corner, every shadow, every unlit stairwell became a potential hiding place, a potential site of disaster. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, minutes bleeding into hours, each tick of the clock a drumbeat of mounting dread within the apartment. The investigation began in a chaotic, fumbling manner. Officers moved methodically, but the tools and forensic understanding of the era were limited. Fingerprints were taken from the doorframe and crib rail, but the methods lacked precision. A small plastic toy, potentially a clue, was bagged haphazardly, its edges scuffed in the process. Every action, however well-intentioned, carried the unintentional risk of erasing evidence or altering the narrative of that morning. Evelyn stood nearby, clutching a damp shawl around her shoulders, watching as her world was examined under a cold procedural lens. Every glance from the officers, a reminder of the fragility of life and certainty. The emotional impact on Evelyn was immediate and suffocating. Her mind oscillated between disbelief, self-recrimination, and a clawing fear that refused to be silenced. She replayed every morning routine, Every moment Melissa had toddled across the living room floor, every glance at the window, and every step she had taken away from the crib. Each memory became both a comfort and a torment, a cruel reminder that even her most careful attention had not been enough to prevent disaster. Outside, Fort Worth's small community began to respond. People emerged from their homes with umbrellas, joining search parties or offering quiet words of support. There was a collective breath held, a shared understanding that the ordinary had been violently disrupted. Mothers clutched children closer. Fathers scanned streets with sharper eyes. The town's texture, the smell of rain-soaked asphalt, the faint whiff of frying bacon from a diner, the creak of old wooden porches was suddenly imbued with a tense, fearful weight. Initial clues emerged, sparse and fragmented. A neighbor reported seeing a man near the alley behind the building earlier that morning, his silhouette partially obscured by the mist. A discarded Polaroid, found near the complex, showed Melissa's bright smile frozen in time, a poignant echo of innocence now tinged with tragedy. Evelyn's grief was punctuated by hope in these fragments. She clung to each potential lid as if it could bridge the chasm opening between her and her daughter. The limitations of the era's investigative methods became painfully clear. Officers lacked the ability to cross-reference minor details efficiently. Physical evidence was stored in loosely organized files. Witness statements were handwritten, susceptible to interpretation or loss. Small mistakes, like mislabeling items or neglecting seemingly minor observations, created ripples that would later complicate the case. Yet despite the procedural gaps, the emotional intensity drove everyone involved. Volunteers combed through the rain-slick streets, their wet gloves leaving streaks on metal railings and brick walls. Every corner of the neighborhood, every tree in the nearby park, every flickering lamppost was examined as if the answer might materialize in the ordinary textures of a city. Desperate to keep a child safe, Evelyn's family joined the search. Her mother's presence a small pillar of strength amid overwhelming despair. Together, they moved through the apartment, through streets still slick with rain, and into the alleys where shadows pooled like dark water. Their eyes traced patterns in the world that had once been familiar, now transformed into a labyrinth of fear. Each sound, the distant bark of a dog, the scrape of shoes on wet concrete, the rustle of wind through the trees, was amplified into the tense, anxious background of a mother's search for her lost child. As hours passed, the sense of helplessness deepened. The search revealed nothing definitive. Melissa's small world, the crib, the toys, the tiny Polaroid photographs, was intact but incomplete. Every item left behind was a fragment, a whisper of presence that could not replace the child herself. Evelyn's grief intertwined with procedural frustration. She watched officers and volunteers move through her home and neighborhood, knowing that no method, no effort, could immediately restore the presence that had been stolen from her dot by nightfall. The city's atmosphere had shifted into heavy anticipation and dread. Rain continued to fall in steady sheets, the streets reflecting the flickering lights of patrol cars and flashlights. Search teams persisted, yet the shadows of uncertainty pressed closer, weaving tension into every corner, every alley, every building for God. Evelyn, exhausted, soaked through, and trembling, could only cling to fragments of hope, a trace of a footprint, a possible sighting, the memory of a laugh echoing through her apartment. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The years that followed stretched like a slow, merciless tide, eroding the certainty of Evelyn's life and the fragile memory of Melissa's laughter. The case grew cold almost immediately. Officers rotated, records were misplaced, and small details like the red ribbon, the Polaroid, and the abandoned shoe vanished into the procedural void. In the absence of answers, grief became a constant companion, threading itself into the texture of Evelyn's daily existence. Each morning, she rose to routines punctuated by absence. Empty crib sheets, quiet corners where Melissa had once explored, and the relentless echo of questions that had no voice. Time itself became a distortion, years folding over each other in fragmented recollections. Fort Worth continued its rhythm. Neon signs flickered against dusky streets. Children's laughter filled playgrounds, and the smell of fried food from diners clung to humid air. Yet for Evelyn, the city was haunted. Every shadow, every unknown figure in a doorway, every unfamiliar car passing the apartment building revived the memory of the day she last saw her daughter. Each small noise, the hum of a heater, the scrape of a broom, the faint squeak of a swing triggered an involuntary jolt, a flash of imagined horror. The failure of the initial investigation left scars not only in memory but in tangible evidence. Forensics at the time were rudimentary. Fingerprints had been smudged, potential leads overlooked, and witness statements scattered. The small missteps accumulated over time, forming a barrier between truth and recovery. The institutional limitations of law enforcement in the era were evident. Cases like Melissa's often became cataloged files, quietly shelved as unsolved, the people behind them fading from the system's focus. Evelyn carried the consequences of these lapses daily, a constant reminder that bureaucracy could never mend a mother's anguish. Her grief was compounded by the subtle, unspoken erosion of trust in her environment. Neighbors, initially supportive, withdrew as time passed, the intensity of collective concern fading into routine indifference. Friends offered polite condolences at first, but eventually stopped asking, as if silence could erase the memory of the missing child. The apartment that had once held the warmth of morning light and Melissa's laughter now resonated with echoes of absence. The creaking floorboards, the wind tapping against windows, the faint hum of distant traffic all became reminders that life had continued. But Melissa had not. Evelyn's own memories began to warp under the strain of grief and guilt. She replayed the final moments repeatedly, interrogating herself over every decision, every step she had taken that day. Could she have noticed the shadow of a stranger? Could she have closed a window tighter, followed Melissa more closely? These questions became rituals, compulsions that gnawed at her sleep and her waking hours alike. Each unanswered question deepened the emotional scar, layering confusion atop sorrow in an intricate, inescapable pattern. Friends and family became secondary witnesses to her slow collapse. Her mother, once a pillar of quiet support, aged noticeably over these years, her visits tinged with frustration and helplessness. Evelyn's ex-husband remained largely absent, offering sporadic words that failed to bridge the chasm of guilt and grief. Community responses, once fervent, dwindled to occasional nods or brief greetings. Melissa's story, so vivid in those early days, began to fade from collective memory, leaving Evelyn to carry the weight of remembrance alone. Even the physical city shifted subtly, though Evelyn could barely notice. Streets were repaved, storefronts changed hands, the neon flickers of old diners replaced by modern signs. Yet in the alleys, in the shadows where Melissa's presence had last been felt, the city remained a repository of memory. Every change in landscape, every reconstruction, felt like a further erasure of the child's existence. Evelyn would walk those streets decades later, tracing the invisible lines of a life that had been stolen. Each brick, each pavement, each fading street sign a testament to absence. Over time, rumors and fragmented recollections passed between neighbors, vague sightings, whispers of strangers, partial memories that refused to coalesce. None offered answers, yet all fueled Evelyn's fractured hope. She clung to each fragment, each possibility, even as decades added layers of dust to the original investigation. Evidence thought lost fingerprints, photographs, witness notes faded into obscurity, often mishandled by changing custodians. Reflecting the limitations of memory bureaucracy, and time itself. Institutional failure compounded personal trauma. Letters went unanswered, files were misplaced, and the sense of urgency that had marked the first weeks of Melissa's disappearance evaporated under the weight of routine. Evelyn's pleas, her persistent reminders, became minor annoyances in the system she had once relied on. The emotional scars were indelible, a life stretched across decades in the shadow of unresolved grief. Haunted by the knowledge that answers, though theoretically possible, remained locked behind human error and institutional neglect. Even now, decades later, the echoes of those years ripple through Evelyn's perception of the city. A child's laughter in a playground might trigger hope, quickly eclipsed by a memory of absence. A lost shoe, a misplaced ribbon, a Polaroid torn at the edges. Each object carries a disproportionate emotional weight, reminders that trauma does not pass with time. It mutates, lingering in corners, in shadows, in the textures of everyday life. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? Decades later, the case of Melissa Hymeth remained a dormant ember, a quiet ache in Evelyn's life, until Detective Clara Jennings arrived in Fort Worth. Clara was methodical, her mind attuned to patterns overlooked by others. Her eyes trained to see the subtleties of human behavior and the faint traces that linger in forgotten spaces. She had read Melissa's file multiple times, each page a mosaic of gaps and tentative leads, and felt an almost tangible weight of urgency. For her, cold cases were not merely puzzles. They were living echoes of absent voices, cries frozen in time. Clara's arrival coincided with a rainy afternoon reminiscent of that fateful morning so many years ago. The city seemed to remember. Streets glistened under the drizzle, neon signs fractured into molten light and puddles, and the faint smell of wet asphalt mingled with lingering smoke from distant grills. Every sensory detail, the rhythm of rainfall against windows, the muted hum of distant traffic, the creaking of old floorboards was amplified in her investigation, and each fragment became a potential key to understanding the past. The first breakthrough came through a painstaking review of archival materials. Old witness statements, once thought trivial, revealed patterns that had gone unnoticed. Inconsistent sightings of a man near the apartment complex, the timing of phone calls received by neighbors, and the sequence of small observations recorded in hastily scribbled notes. Each overlooked detail now held significance, forming a lattice of possibility that had eluded investigators decades earlier. Clara traced the faintest threads, mapping Melissa's movements, her mother's routines, and the ambient details of the neighborhood with forensic precision. Modern forensics offered tools previously unimaginable. DNA swabs collected from stored evidence, Melissa's crib rail, the abandoned shoe. Fragments of clothing were analyzed with technology that could distinguish the faintest biological trace from contamination decades old. Digital databases allowed cross-referencing with patterns in nearby disappearances, revealing connections that had once seemed purely coincidental. Clara's meticulous approach combined emotional sensitivity with technological rigor, creating a bridge between the grief that had persisted in Evelyn's life and the objective pursuit of truth. Witnesses, too, came forward with memories long suppressed. An elderly neighbor recalled details of the morning Melissa vanished, the subtle presence of a man, the faint sound of a car door, the shifting of shadows in the apartment courtyard. Their recollections were fragmented, tinged with the patina of decades. Yet Clara extracted coherence from the haze, weaving together narrative strands that had lain dormant. Each revelation resonated emotionally, reawakening Evelyn's pain but also instilling a cautious hope. The past, long dormant, was stirring into life. As forensic evidence aligned with testimonial reconstructions, Clara uncovered discrepancies that suggested critical mishandling in the original investigation. Evidence had been stored without proper cataloging. Witness statements had been misfiled or disregarded. Minor clues that might have cracked the case early were overlooked. The emotional fallout for Evelyn was intense. Years of grief and isolation were compounded by the knowledge that human error and bureaucratic oversight had obscured the path to truth. Yet, paradoxically, these same errors now offered new leads. Mistakes of the past became the pivot points for uncovering what had been hidden. The emotional shockwaves of reopening the case rippled through the community. Former neighbors, now decades older, revisited streets once familiar, their own memories of that rainy morning returning with vivid clarity. Former officers, some retired, were interviewed, their recollections intertwined with regret and unresolved tension. The city itself, its damp streets, flickering neon signs, and quiet parks became a canvas upon which the invisible threads of Melissa's disappearance were traced with painstaking attention. Clara's investigation also unearthed overlooked documents, maps of the neighborhood with minor annotations, a diary entry from Evelyn's mother detailing small, seemingly inconsequential observations, and fragments of photographs showing Melissa's movements in the days preceding her disappearance. Each artifact carried weight, providing both chronological anchors and emotional resonance. Clara treated these items with reverence, aware that the details were not only evidentiary, but also fragments of a life violently interrupted in parallel. Evelyn's own memories resurfaced with heightened intensity. Small sensory triggers, a child's laughter, the patter of rain, the smell of old linoleum resurrected the days of hope, fear, and despair. Clara guided her through the process with patience, recognizing that emotional truth was as critical as physical evidence. The case became not merely a search for facts, but a reconstruction of a fractured world. A careful restoration of context and chronology that had been lost to time. Through methodical reconstruction, technological advancements, and emotional resonance, the dormant case began to yield results. Patterns formed, fragments coalesced, and a tentative path toward answers emerged. Clara's relentless pursuit was both procedural and profoundly human, an acknowledgement that behind every cold case was a network of emotions, memories, and lives disrupted. The community, long silent, found itself drawn into the unfolding truth, each revelation reverberating with decades of accumulated grief and hope. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The pieces finally began to converge. Clara Jennings' meticulous reconstruction illuminated a pattern that had long eluded investigators. The timeline of Melissa's last morning, once a fragmented narrative, now formed a coherent sequence. The small clues, an abandoned shoe, a crumpled ribbon, a Polaroid photograph, each found renewed significance. The abandoned shoe, initially considered incidental, contained traces of soil matching the narrow alley behind the apartment complex. The ribbon, faintly frayed, bore microscopic fibers consistent with the clothing of a previously overlooked suspect who had been seen lingering near the building. In the weeks leading up to Melissa's disappearance, forensic confirmation amplified the shock. DNA recovered from a small piece of fabric in the alley matched a man with a minor criminal record, previously dismissed by officers decades earlier due to lack of corroborating evidence. Modern techniques allowed for digital triangulation of his whereabouts, confirming that he had been near the apartment during critical time windows. This revelation reframed the investigation, turning vague suspicions into tangible leads. The emotional weight of discovery pressed on Evelyn, her heart caught between hope and the bitter recollection of years lost to uncertainty. Parallel timelines revealed deeper betrayals. Archival police documents, once assumed reliable, contained omissions and discrepancies suggesting negligence, if not deliberate cover-up. Certain witness statements had been suppressed, others misfiled. Sergeant Leonard, now retired, admitted years later that bureaucratic pressure and limited resources had led to hasty closures in similar cases. These institutional failures, once abstract, now felt intensely personal to Evelyn, intertwining grief with indignation. Her daughter's disappearance had not been entirely inevitable. It had been worsened by human error. The suspect's psychological profile emerged from interviews with people who had known him at the time. He was described as meticulous, calculating, and socially elusive, a man who navigated spaces with an unsettling invisibility. His prior offenses, while minor, suggested a pattern of opportunistic behavior, often preying on vulnerabilities in the environment. The analysis of his behavioral tendencies offered chilling insight into the precision with which Melissa had been targeted and the meticulous nature of her abduction. New witness revelations shifted the narrative further. A former neighbor, hesitant for decades, recounted seeing a car parked unusually close to the apartment complex on the morning of Melissa's disappearance. The vehicle, nondescript and partially obscured by mist, had been dismissed at the time as ordinary. Combined with modern forensic mapping and traffic analysis, it became a critical piece in reconstructing the suspect's movements. Each revelation layered urgency and clarity onto the decades-old mystery, transforming uncertainty into near certainty. Clara's team also discovered small, overlooked physical evidence, a partial footprint in hardened soil in the alley. Previously deemed irrelevant, now matched the suspect's shoe size and tread. A faint smear of paint on the fabric of Melissa's crib sheet correlated with a vehicle he had been known to operate. These minute details, once buried under procedural oversight, now resonated with terrifying precision. The case, long dormant, began to take form like a shadow emerging from the fog, revealing the contours of truth hidden for decades. As the investigative mosaic assembled, Evelyn confronted a mix of emotions: grief, rage, relief, and a piercing sense of injustice. The years lost could not be recovered, yet the clarity of fact offered a measure of closure long denied. The community, too, felt the weight of revelation. Neighbors who had once quietly carried fragments of suspicion now saw the contours of the crime with unsettling lucidity. The city streets, wet with memory and past storms, bore silent witness to decades of absence now met with the intensity of renewed attention. The timeline reconstruction was painstaking. Using modern forensic science, digital archives, and witness testimonies, investigators were able to place Melissa, the suspect, and the surrounding environment in precise relation to one another. Each step, each minute, now formed part of an intricate map of the abduction. Evelyn followed the reconstructions with a mix of trepidation and fascination, her memory intertwined with new evidence, her grief merging with a cautious hope that the mystery could finally reach a resolution. By the time Clara concluded the latest series of interviews and analysis, the picture was undeniable. The suspect had taken advantage of both environmental opportunity and systemic oversight. Corruption, incompetence, and human error had created a space in which Melissa's disappearance had gone unnoticed beyond the immediate panic. Yet now, armed with modern forensics, witness testimony, and psychological profiling, investigators could see the crime in its entirety for the first time. The path to justice, long obscured by time and error, was finally illuminated. The arrest was orchestrated with the precision of a decade-spanning puzzle finally snapping into place. It was early morning when officers, led by Clara Jennings, approached the suspect's residence. The streets of Fort Worth were quiet, shrouded in a thin mist that clung to the asphalt, reflecting the pale glow of streetlights. Every footstep, every click of the handcuffs, echoed in the stillness, a grim chorus announcing that decades of uncertainty were about to collide with the relentless clarity of justice. The suspect, a man long assumed by some to be harmless or irrelevant, now faced the weight of accumulated evidence. DNA matches, witness testimonies, behavioral analysis, and the precise reconstruction of movements created an unassailable case. He had long believed the past had buried his crime beneath layers of oversight and forgetfulness. Now, the meticulous work of investigators stripped away every shield, revealing him in stark, undeniable truth. As officers entered the residence, the air was thick with tension. Dust motes floated in shafts of early light, settling on neglected furniture and cluttered surfaces. Every creak of floorboards, every scrape of a shoe against tile, resonated with the weight of decades of unanswered questions. Clara's team moved methodically, her voice calm but firm as she read the rights and confirmed the arrest. The suspect's initial expression, a mask of defiance, cracked, subtly under the scrutiny of years of evidence now converging in real time. For Evelyn, the news of the arrest hit like a physical blow. She had aged with the weight of absence pressing against her chest, every year of unanswered questions etched into her features. Now, decades later, the man who had stolen her child from her sight was confronted by the consequences of his actions. Her grief surged, mingled with an almost physical sense of vindication. The world, for a brief moment, aligned with the justice her heart had demanded for so long. Community reactions were equally profound. Former neighbors, once silent witnesses to the ordinary rhythms of life in the apartment complex, gathered in hushed anticipation. Conversations paused mid-step in the streets, the hum of distant traffic subdued beneath the weight of revelation. The arrest rippled through the city, stirring memories, guilt, relief, and a collective reckoning with a past that had seemed immutable. Each witness, each participant in the decades-long investigation, felt the gravity of closure inching closer. As though the city itself exhaled after decades of holding its breath, the interrogation that followed was cinematic in its intensity. Clara and her team presented evidence meticulously, laying out timelines, DNA results, and witness testimonies. The suspect's defenses crumbled gradually, the weight of incontrovertible proof dismantling every fabricated alibi, every forgotten lie, every calculated attempt to evade responsibility. The room felt heavy with decades of unspoken truths, the air thick with the electric tension of revelation. The man who had once moved unseen, a shadow among shadows, now confronted the concentrated weight of justice amassed over decades. Within the apartment where Melissa had lived, tangible echoes of the past pressed against the walls. The crib, still preserved in memory, if not in physical presence, became a symbol of both absence and the meticulous reconstruction of reality. Evelyn revisited spaces where small fragments had remained, the corner of the living room, the faint imprint of toys on the rug, the crumpled ribbon now stored in evidence. Each object, each scent, each texture carried decades of accumulated memory, a mosaic of grief and hope intertwined. Finally, the arrest closed a chapter that had been left ajar for far too long. Evidence, once lost or mishandled, now converged with clarity. Fingerprints matched, fibers aligned, timelines reconstructed. The community, Evelyn, and even the city itself could now see the contours of a crime that had long been obscured by time. Suspense, doubt, and uncertainty gave way to the hard edges of truth. The emotional peak was both bitter and cathartic, grief and relief intertwined, a testament to the persistence of human memory and the eventual triumph of careful, patient investigation. Melissa's case, long a haunting absence, was finally anchored in tangible reality. The threads of mystery that had unraveled across decades now coalesced into a coherent resolution. The suspect's capture was not merely procedural, it was a profound emotional reckoning, a confirmation that truth, though delayed, would endure. Evelyn's grief, still profound, now carried the possibility of closure, a chance to navigate the remainder of her life with the knowledge that justice had been wrought, even after decades of silence. The final discovery arrived like a whisper long overdue. Forensic analysts, working in tandem with Clara Jennings and her team, confirmed the full scope of the evidence collected over decades. DNA matches, fiber analyses, and timeline reconstructions all converged on a single truth. Melissa Highmouth's disappearance, once a fragmentary nightmare, now had a defined narrative, one that aligned the chaos of memory with the precision of modern science. Every small clue, the crumpled ribbon, the abandoned shoe, the Polaroid photograph, was accounted for. Each piece a silent witness that had waited patiently for the right moment to speak. Evelyn visited the crime lab to see the final reports. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper, a sterile backdrop to the raw intensity of decades-old grief. She held the printouts in her trembling hands, scanning the pages with painstaking attention. Every chart, every DNA confirmation, every witness statement was a confirmation of a truth she had carried in her heart for over 40 years. Tears ran freely down her cheeks, an amalgam of sorrow, relief, and the bittersweetness of a story finally made whole. The emotional resolution extended beyond the scientific. Evelyn, once constrained by the isolation of grief, began to reconnect with the community that had surrounded her long ago. Former neighbors, some now elderly, gathered to offer quiet acknowledgments, small gestures of solidarity for the mother who had waited decades for answers. The city itself, though unchanged in its streets and neon glows, seemed to participate in a subtle reconciliation, the rain-washed pavement reflecting a fragile sense of closure that had been denied for generations. Clara Jennings, standing with Evelyn on the steps of the apartment building where Melissa had lived, allowed a moment of stillness. The wet streets shimmered beneath the diffuse glow of morning light, and for the first time in decades, the past and present aligned. Every meticulous investigation, every painstaking review of lost evidence, had led to this culmination, the restoration of clarity, the resolution of uncertainty, the affirmation that persistence could wrest truth from even the deepest shadows. The suspect's conviction followed. The judicial process, a formal acknowledgement of justice, long delayed. Courtrooms, filled with reporters, officers, and community members, became theaters of reconciliation. The painstaking presentation of evidence, the careful chronicling of events, the emotional testimony of a mother whose life had been defined by absence. The conviction was not merely legal, it was a symbolic rectification of a past wrong. A tangible acknowledgement that Melissa's life, though cut short in memory, had demanded recognition. In the quiet aftermath, Evelyn returned to the apartment, now empty, yet full of memory. She walked the rooms where Melissa had toddled, fingers brushing over familiar textures, the edge of the crib, the worn linoleum beneath her feet, the faint scent of childhood that lingered like a ghost. Each object, each corner, was a repository of memory, a testament to innocence lost and the resilience of love. She spoke softly to the empty room, a whispered tribute to a daughter whose life, though brief in presence, had been vast in emotional impact. Melissa's story, though marked by trauma and loss, now held a measure of completeness. Her life was remembered not just in absence, but in the meticulous reconstruction of her final moments, in the persistent pursuit of justice, and in the emotional resonance that carried through the lives she touched. Her laughter, her curiosity, her small victories, the stacking of blocks, the tracing of crayon on paper, the tiny hands reaching for the world, were no longer swallowed entirely by memory. They existed now in a preserved, acknowledged truth. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.